Hi, team. Whether we're delivering a speech in an hour or 3 months from now, it can be a bit of a daunting task to figure out, where do I even start developing this speech? In this video, I'm going to cover the 5 questions I ask myself anytime I'm getting ready to deliver a speech, whether it's in the classroom as a lecture, some kind of training, or any other kind of speech out in the community. The first question I ask myself is, what is the intent of this speech? Now, this is kind of a foundational question, and sometimes we might think, well, that's obvious. Well, I'm delivering a training, or I'm the best man in this wedding. I'm delivering some kind of motivational speech. But the importance in defining and answering this question comes from reminding us, what is the tone we want to set for this speech? How do we want our audience to feel over the course of that speech? If we're delivering a training, say we're delivering some kind of safety training, we might have more of a serious tone to it because we want to make sure our audience and our employees know exactly how to correctly perform certain procedures or tasks to ensure they don't get hurt. Whereas if we're the maid of honor in a wedding, we might be more upbeat and we want our audience to have fun and to laugh and to understand what it was like growing up with this individual. That first question, again, helps set the tone for how we're going to go about laying out the rest of the speech. The second question I ask myself is, what are those 2 or 3 takeaways that I want to make sure the audience gets out of this speech? Whenever we think about creating a speech, it really doesn't matter on the topic. If we're going to onboard 10 or 15 new employees, or we're delivering a speech at a graduation ceremony, we have many different ideas and thoughts that get into our head. Oh, I want to talk about this. Oh, I want to include this. Oh, I want to. By asking ourselves and clearly defining what are those 2 or 3 main takeaways, we're laying out the foundation for what is the speech going to look like. We're outlining, in this part, we're going to cover this takeaway. In the middle, maybe we're covering takeaway 2, and in the back end, we're covering and addressing takeaway number 3. What this does for us is help set the context for what do we do with all this information we thought we were interested in sharing. If the information we're interested in sharing does not fall under one of those 2 or 3 takeaways, we probably should not be including it because it just doesn't make sense. The third question I like to ask myself is, how do I want the audience to feel at the very start, during the speech, and as I'm finishing up that speech? As I'm walking away, how do I want the audience to feel? This question is really important because it can help us organize and better understand, well, where do we want to be introducing these takeaways? If we want our audience to feel motivated or encouraged or inspired, well, maybe we want to position that takeaway somewhere toward the end. We want to leave our audience feeling inspired. Okay, that's important for us to remember because we have to set up this rest of the speech. We have to set up how we conclude that speech in a manner in which they're going to feel inspired. If we want them to feel some kind of deep connection with us, or we want to make sure they understand why a topic or concept is so important, well, we have to have a story. We have to have something that conveys that importance or that significance. So by outlining how we want them to feel at the start, during, and after, we can clearly influence what that speech is going to look like to ensure we convey and shape those feelings throughout. The fourth question I ask myself relates to how are we starting to bring together content? That question is specifically, what will help me or what will help us convey this message? If we have these three different takeaways, well, what information, what experience, what knowledge does our audience have to have in order for them to get that takeaway? Are we going to have to define some terms? Are we going to have to describe what this means? Are we going to have to describe why it's important? Do we have stories, personal experiences, or stories we may have seen in the news that help us convey this idea, that help us convey to the audience, this is takeaway one, and this is why it's so important for us? We can do that with each of the three takeaways, reminding ourselves, what information does the audience need to have in order for them to actually take that takeaway with them? The last question, and frankly, this is the question that we should really be having fun with: how will I craft this story? Regardless of the length of a speech, I think it's really helpful to look at it as a story. Even if we're delivering some kind of training, there should be a starting point, a middle, and some type of conclusion. Every single lecture I create has a start, a middle, and a conclusion, and each lecture is a chapter in a much larger textbook. If we craft our speeches along the lines of telling a story, what we're doing is creating something that feels very natural, that's very organized, that's going to feel comfortable for our audience, and it's going to be much, much easier for us as these speakers to recall and remember exactly where are we going with this speech. Again, by asking ourselves these 5 questions, we're going to be setting ourselves up to be very strong in crafting and delivering a high-impact speech for our audience. Hey team, if you found this video helpful, hit the subscribe button, as each week we're putting out more videos related to not only the screw-ups I've made in my career, but also the strategies we can use to help us advance in our careers. Time for development. Invest in yourself.